behalf of Stephanie Clark, our director, and Aaron Webster Chambers, our program coordinator, I'm so happy that the Center for Justice Reform was able to be one of the sponsors of this rather remarkable day. Special thanks to Carla and Rico and Kyron, Ray, Susan, and others at Balsa for helping to pull this event together. I was a prosecutor for 22 years, almost 16 as an elected state's attorney. I've been to 1 or 2 criminal justice conferences over the years, put on by the National District Attorneys Association, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, and regional and statewide prosecutors' conferences. I can say, based on what I've heard today, the dialogue has changed considerably. And that's really good news. Long way to go, but incredible progress. So to continue that reform-minded and innovative dialogue, we have a wonderful panel today. I am just very briefly going to introduce them, and then I'm going to ask each of them to spend between 5 and 10 minutes, and really no more than 10 minutes, introducing themselves a little bit more thoroughly to you, telling you about the work that they're doing and maybe some particular aspect of that work that is really exciting. I have a few questions that I hope will generate some dialogue by the panelists, and then I'm sure we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So, all the way at the end is Sia Henry from Impact Justice in Oakland, California. Next is Willa Farrell from the Vermont Attorney General's Office. Next to Willa is Anton Robinson from the Vera Institute in New York City. And closest to me is Mark Hughes from the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance here in Vermont. So Sia has a presentation, so she'll probably move for that. Other folks, wherever you feel comfortable. So no, if you want to move, so we'll start Sia Henry, and are we all right with, say, 5 to 10 minutes for this initial? Perfect.
I will give you 8
Sia.
minutes. Okay, bear with me. I'm going on like 3 hours of sleep, so see how this goes. So hi, everyone. I am Sia Henry. I work at Impact Justice. We are headquartered in Oakland, California, but I work out of our DC office. And we are a national innovation and research center. We're a nonprofit dedicated to significantly reducing the number of people who enter our criminal legal system, providing meaningful support to people, to currently incarcerated people, and then also supporting people as they transition from being incarcerated and then returning to our communities. So we have a number of different project areas, but I'm specifically here to talk about our Restorative Justice Project and the work that we're doing to support communities in establishing pre-charge restorative justice diversion programs. But before I get into that, forgot this was here. Before I get into that, I want to take a moment to define restorative justice. Restorative justice has kind of been this term that has kind of blown up over the last couple of years, and I think that there's a lot of confusion about what it actually is. So I'm going to try to, in a couple moments, shed some light on that. But I like to do that by comparing restorative justice to our current criminal legal system. So when you hear that a crime has occurred, let's say someone were to run in here right now and just say, a crime has been committed, what are some initial questions that you might first ask? Just yell them out. What did you do? Are you okay? Okay. All right, hold on. I heard, what did the person do, which we can also phrase as what law was broken. I also heard who did it? Thank you, cool. Who broke that law? So let's say we know that Johnny burglarized Susie's home. Now what might we want to know? Damage. Is Susie okay? That's lovely. Don't worry, Susie's okay. We'll get to that. What else? What are the penalties? Thank you. Okay, this is all I needed. Thank you, though. You guys are awesome. So our current criminal legal system essentially asks 3 questions. It asks what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished. So in restorative justice, we ask a very different set of questions. We asked who was harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. So when you see these 2 questions side by side, who are we focusing on in the current criminal legal system? The person responsible or the person who caused harm. Thank you. I love that you guys are on top of the language here. This is awesome. In restorative justice world, who are we focusing on? Exactly, the person harmed or the survivor of that crime. So then that kind of brings us to the question, okay, great, so then what is restorative justice? And I love to remind people that restorative justice isn't just another program or another tool, it's a complete paradigm shift. And so what we're doing is we're shifting from viewing crime as a violation of the law or harm against the state to understanding it to be a violation or harm against people and relationships that requires individual, interpersonal, community, and system-wide accountability and healing. And so 2 things to note here, and I'm sorry if this is kind of basic for those of you that have gone through the RJ program here. This isn't anything new, right? So this is something that Indigenous people around the world have engaged in for centuries. Restorative justice is just kind of the modern term that we've settled on. And also, restorative justice is kind of this umbrella term. And so it's not just for addressing harm. It can be used for a number of different things. It can be used for relationship building and celebrations or to mourn a loss. But the specific model that my organization, Impact Justice, works with was designed for addressing harm. So that brings us to the model that we work with. So our model comes from New Zealand, and so there in about the 80s, their government commissioned a report that found an overrepresentation of their Indigenous Maori people in their criminal legal system. So as a result, they completely transformed their juvenile justice system and fashioned it off of the traditional way that the Maori people would address harm. And so now over the last couple of decades, their entire juvenile justice system has been using a process called family group conferencing. What we've done at Impact Justice is we've adopted that model for the United States, and we just happen to call it restorative justice diversion. And so our model has a number of different moving parts, but just to highlight a couple of those, again, we're centralizing the needs of people harmed, specifically recognizing that victims have the right to define what justice or healing looks like to them. We also have a very explicit goal of ending racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal legal system, and our model is exclusively pre-charge. So we are basically centralizing, like physically localizing the process of addressing harm within the communities that harm occurs and trying to remove the state as much as possible from that process. Let's see. So our model of restorative justice diversion, it's 2 kind of main requirements before I get into the details about it. It's specifically for serious harm where there's an identifiable victim. So assaults, burglaries, arson. One of my supervisors, Sujata Balaga, is actually looking at the use of restorative justice diversion to address child sexual abuse. So again, serious harm. And then the other requirement here is that the person who caused the harm admit guilt or accept responsibility or accountability. Great, so that brings us to the process of the part you've all been waiting for. So what happens is, let's say a young person causes harm, let's say they rob someone. Before that case is ever charged, the police, probation, and the district attorney all have the opportunity to divert that case to a community-based organization that we've trained in the restorative justice diversion model. So that case gets diverted. So then a coordinator from that organization meets with all of the affected parties. So they meet with the victim and the victim's family or support system, as well as the young person, the young person's family and support system. There's a ton of prep work that goes into that process. And then once all of those parties are ready and comfortable, the coordinator brings everyone together for a conference. And during that conference, everyone in the room has a chance to speak. So the victim has a chance to talk about how the harm affected them. The young person gets to speak about why they did what they did, and the family members or support systems in the room also have a chance to talk. At the end of that conference, everyone in the room comes up with collectively agrees on a plan to support that young person in making things right to the victim, his or her family, their community, and also his or herself. And that process also typically involves connecting that young person to services. So it's not just like handing a young person a plan saying, go do this. There's a lot of support that's built into that plan. It's a very specific plan. Once that young person completes that plan, typically within about 6 months, oftentimes less than that, then no charges ever filed, the case is closed. So we've been talking a lot today about data, and people like to know, okay, that's awesome, but does it actually work? So we have programs in a number of different sites all over the country, and I'll get to that in a second, but our oldest running program is operating out of Oakland, California, in Alameda County, if you're familiar with California, through an organization called Community Works, and they've been running this restorative justice diversion program since 2008. So what we did was we tracked the young people that went through that program for a couple years, and we found that the young people who went through our restorative justice diversion program had about an 18% recidivism rate compared to similarly situated youth who went through Alameda's regular juvenile justice system. They had about a 32% recidivism rate. I just found out about a week ago that our program in San Francisco has about a 13% recidivism rate compared to a 53% recidivism rate for San Francisco's regular juvenile justice system. Our program is also significantly cheaper. It costs about $10,000 per case from start to finish, and actually once the program is brought to scale, it's actually a little bit cheaper. It's about $7,000 per case. Comparatively, in Alameda County, it costs just under $500,000 to keep a young person in Alameda County's juvenile detention center for a year. And there are some reasons for that cost, but I won't get into that. And then finally, again, since our program is centralizing the needs of people harmed, 91% of them who've gone through this program said that they would recommend this program to a loved one. And of course, our regular criminal legal system doesn't hand out satisfaction surveys at the end of the process, but we like to assume that the satisfaction of victims who have their cases processed through the court system would be a lot lower. So then finally, I promise I'm almost done. Where is restorative justice diversion happening? We currently have programs up and running in Oakland, California, San Francisco, Richmond, California, Long Beach, and Nashville. And we're working to get programs off the ground in Miami and Philadelphia, and really excited. We're actually in the very early stages of conversations with a couple jurisdictions in the South, which is really awesome. So that's it.
Willa.
Okay. I think this is a good segue. My name is Willa Farrell, and I work in the Attorney General's office here in Vermont with court diversion and pretrial services. And I just want to note that there are many people here who actually do the work. So we have Rachel from Chittenden, Becky from Lamoille, Ellen and Maureen from Windsor County here, and I think Jesse and Kim are still here from Orange County. And Danielle, who is a student here, is from Addison County, but I think may have left already. So I just want to speak really briefly about court diversion and pretrial services in Vermont. So court diversion in Vermont has been around for 40 years. I would say it was much more a community justice program originally and has increasingly become a restorative justice program. So the work we do is with youth and adults and is really similar to what Sia just described. In Vermont, in the last few years, there's really been a huge burgeoning use of these services. So about a third of, let me make sure I got these numbers right, half of delinquencies last fiscal year were referred to court diversion. And about a third of misdemeanors out of the adult criminal division were referred to diversion. So prosecutors are really relying on these alternatives. So I think it's interesting, we're talking about criminal justice reform and restorative justice, and in some ways, currently in Vermont, it is part of the system, but in many ways, we're also, I think, on the cutting edge of reform that is happening. 2 years ago, we formed a new diversionary program that's called Tamarack. It's adult diversion, but it's focused for people who have substance use or mental health treatment needs, regardless of their criminal record. So historically, diversion in Vermont has been like first or second time offense, low level. People coming to Tamarack may have really extensive criminal history records and are struggling with substance use and pretty much typically mental health treatment needs. And for all the reasons that people have been really clear and articulate about through the day today. Last year, there were about 1,000 people in Vermont who went through that program, and that number has ratcheted up in the last few years, and this year also. We also provide what we call pretrial services, which isn't a restorative justice program because it's support for people as they are going through the system, but in terms of justice reform, I think it's worth noting. Within pretrial services, which is a court order by the judge, typically asked for by the prosecutor, the goal of that service is to connect people with treatment. And if people don't engage, there's no legal ramification for that. It's really a voluntary engagement. Again, trying to meet people at a really pivotal point in their life and get them the support or re-engage with supports. So I just want to talk a little bit briefly. That's just my brief overview of what we do, and happy to provide anyone more information. And there are people, obviously, whom I've noticed who could tell you a lot more, like stories about the actual work being done. But I want to touch really briefly on some of the intersection I see with restorative justice and criminal justice reform. I don't think you can separate out other concepts that we've heard about around procedural justice. Also, we really try to use what we call risk-need responsivity principles, so connecting the risk level. If somebody's low risk, we shouldn't be doing much with intervening in that young person or adult's life. Looking at people's needs. Within the work of restorative justice, we talk about harms caused, which is sort of the obvious piece, but we also talk about harms revealed and what is revealed in individuals' lives, but also within the community, and what do we as a broader community or society need to be looking at that this incident or crime indicates. We obviously work within a context of poverty, widespread trauma, and structural racism, and I think there'll be many people who've touched on those issues, and we can't not address those if we want to talk about true reform. And then I just want to speak also about that I have more recently been really looking at and trying to understand more about the culture of whiteness. And I think it's important for us, wherever we live, to really be mindful and to be thinking about how the culture of whiteness plays into our world in every aspect, and particularly, obviously, given that I work in this realm within the youth and criminal justice system. And I really think that restorative justice actually provides a good lens, perhaps the word, to examine how that culture of whiteness may have affected the development of restorative justice here in Vermont. And I think if we're really true to the values of restorative justice, we can sort of break that apart and get to really truly meeting people's needs. And so some of the things I see about restorative justice that provide a lens to examining and teasing apart the culture of whiteness is that in restorative justice, we really try not to have a hierarchical system. As Sia described, all the parties have a voice, and it's a collaborative effort to try to reach agreement about how to repair harm and address people's needs. We want to focus on relationships, and we always say that it's always about the relationships. Recognizing that trust has been harmed between individuals and between individuals and a broader society. We want to avoid binary thinking, and other people have mentioned that here today. Try to avoid thinking about good and bad, seeing the complexity of lives and when harm is caused. And we often have people who come who may have committed a crime, but at the same time they're victims of crime, and those rules are not static. I think it's also within the realm of restorative justice, we are trying to recognize the reality of emotions and not always be sort of objective, and it can be messy. It's hard. It's really hard work for everybody when this work happens. And of course, we live in a realm of like, well, as Sia said, what's the data? Is this good? People focus on recidivism, and we will always have that question asked of our work, but we also want to be looking at more qualitative outcomes. Were people's needs met? Did they feel like when they left, their dignity was intact? Were people satisfied with the process? So these are, I think, really, it's hard work, and it's hard to remain true to these when your caseload is high and its funding is limited, all those constraints that people have in doing this work. And it's also incredibly rewarding. And I think it's only by adhering to these types of values that we will really see the reform and the broader societal, cultural changes that I and I know many of the people in this room aspire to.
Thank you, Willa. Anton.
Sure. Good afternoon. I want to start doing two things. First, I just want to thank Vermont Law School and BALSA for having us here. It's an amazing event. I feel like I've had the opportunity to meet many of the BALSA students. I am blown away. Like, Vermont Law School, you should really know that BALSA is representing you in an amazing way. I met many of the students in Boston right before school started. I'm looking at you, Carla. Right before school started, and it was maybe a couple of days before, and they were having a planning meeting where they were planning what to do. And my thought process, right, I went to law school. I'm like, wait, you should all be, because you know what's going to happen when you get back. You should all be hanging out, maybe on a beach somewhere, doing something fun. But to see so many of your students working was like something I'd never seen before. So I applaud you, BALSA. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Vermont Law School, for having me here. The second thing that I want to do, I'll get to my name in a second, but it's in the paper. The second thing I want to do is to lift up the name of Calif Browder. And I know a lot of people know about Calif Browder's story, but I just want to lift it up. This was a child when he was arrested in the Bronx. And that child would go on to spend 3 years in Rikers Island. That's 3 years in Rikers Island. 2 years of that time, that child spent in solitary confinement. Just let that sink in. 2 years of a person's life in solitary confinement. And so I lift up his name just to remind us all why we're all here. I know I'm sort of speaking to the choir, right, preaching to the choir in this group, but I don't think we can ever we should never step so far away from the names and the faces and the people that we do this work for every day. And Calif Browder's story, though unique in that it sort of wrapped up a lot of the issues with the criminal legal system, particularly bail reform, right? Mr. Browder was held in on $3,000 bail that his family members could not afford to post. And that $3,000 bail sort of ended up in him being in jail for several years of his life. Solitary confinement. No human being should be in solitary confinement for 2 years. And so what his story did in New York City, which is where I practiced as a public defender and now work at the Vera Institute of Justice as a senior planner, what his story did was it served as a launch pad for many of the reforms that we saw, and by we, I mean many of the advocates in New York, all over New York State, including Vera, but many other advocacy organizations, and public defenders and others. His story put a face to those very real issues that I saw at the time as a public defender every day, right? I went to court every day. I'm looking at you now, Tiffany. Tiffany and I were colleagues at one point. And every day you go to court and you meet new Calif Browders. You meet people who are ensnared within this system that we know is problematic, and in a system that we know we have a responsibility to do something with. And so I also invoke his name because it did lead me to seek out a position in sort of better understanding policy, and so it led me to the Vera Institute of Justice. I want to say that I have some numbers that we could probably talk about, but I'll probably forget them. So I do want to note that I have some materials right over here that if anyone wants to grab those materials, or if you want to catch me, I can give you a card. But our website is vera.org. We're an organization that started back in 1961 to really handle justice issues as best as we could. Our major priorities are to secure equal justice, to end mass incarceration, and to strengthen families and communities. And we do that by harnessing our resources, which means our access to government partners, but also with grassroots organizations, with advocates, and most importantly, the people closest to the issues. And so we make it a part of our responsibility to engage people closest to the issues at the earliest opportunity so that our policy and that our goals are informed by the needs of communities. When I was a public defender, I stood next to thousands of people in arraignment court. And in arraignment court, you walk in as a public defender, you get assigned a case right then. You have maybe 15, 20 minutes to look over the file, go talk to the person, explain to them what is going to happen to them, right? This might be, from most theoretical positions, the worst days of their lives. And you have a few moments to sort of encapsulate what it might mean to walk in front of a judge. And I stood next to many people under those circumstances. And I gotta say that most of them looked like I did. They were young black men. And we stood facing the judge together. And we would hear the charges, and we would hear what the DA had to say, aggravating circumstances in most instances. And then we would have an opportunity to ask for, I would have the opportunity to ask for my client to be released. And unfortunately, that did not happen nearly as much as it should have. I mention that because that led me to Vera to do a very specific project called the Bail Assessment Project. And it was one in New York prior to the reform of our bail laws that actually just went into effect on January 1st. Super proud about that. But before that time, we noticed that many people were sitting in on bail that they simply could not afford. And what that did was it created two justice systems, one for people with resources and one for people without resources. If you had enough money to pay for your release, it didn't matter what amount of bail the judge set, you could be gone. But for my clients, they sat in jail for years sometimes. And they lost jobs. They had hard times maintaining family relationships. Couldn't see their kids. Lost apartments. And if you know anything about the New York housing market, losing an apartment could create instability for you for years to come. And we got to work on a project that not only reminded New York system actors about the importance of sound bail policies and practices, but also that from a pragmatic standpoint said, please, judge, don't hold this person in on an amount that they cannot afford. And so what we did was we actually went to arraignment courts both in the Bronx and in Queens. It was a pilot project at the time, about 2 years ago. And we asked judges to consider the amount the person can afford to pay. And what that meant was we actually had to go in arraignment court prior to the arraignment and do an assessment of a person's ability to pay. And that included learning about the money, not only the money that was coming in, right? So we asked the natural questions about their jobs and if they had any benefits, but you also have to take into account the expenses, the monthly expenses, so that we can get a reasoned example, or sample rather, of that person's monthly disposable income. And so having that extra information from each person that we screened, we were able to note that it had a positive impact, meaning the bail amounts that the judges ultimately set went down. And that was just because we provided more information to the judges about that person's individual circumstances. And so I'm happy to say that after the many advocates sort of coalesced around not only that issue, but many other issues that were plaguing the New York bail system, that on April 1st of last year, the New York legislature passed bail reforms that would essentially do away with cash bail for most misdemeanors and most nonviolent felonies. And that in and of itself has had a tremendous impact. And it just went into effect on January 1st, by the way. But it had a tremendous impact on the amount of people who are in local jails all over New York. So in January of 2019, that number was about 21,000 people. And they started letting some people out around November, obviously given that the reforms were happening. And so between November and today, that number is down to about 15,000 people all over the state of New York. Nice. It's amazing. I want to be clear, Vera is not taking responsibility for that. That was in the hands of many, many advocates all over the state. In fact, it sort of became a nationwide issue as we all sort of look at bail policies and practices and sort of reimagine ways to do that better. So I just want to leave you with that. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about our work at Vera, but I'm so excited to be having this conversation. I will say, too, that when I went to Vera, and we're a research organization, we really harness that power of evidence. Someone mentioned the words imposter syndrome, right? I was this public defender for about 10 years of my life before I went to Vera. And now I'm surrounded by researchers who could probably hack my life. I'm being honest, right? We have really, really smart people at Vera doing really amazing things. And I had to realize that a part of my being here, a part of my reimagining justice, a part of my opportunities to contribute to the work that we were doing was the fact that I've talked to thousands of people who stood next to me in front of a judge at their worst moment. Mm-hmm. And so I say that to other people who might find themselves in different rooms or different spaces and wonder what your contribution is. You know what you have to bring to that table. Don't be shy about it. Put it on the table. Someone entrusted you with their stories. Bring that to your approach to policy reform.
Thank you so much, Anton. Mark.
Wow, Vera. I didn't realize that I was going to be sitting right next to Vera. I was looking at it in the paper. I was like, Vera!
Oh, man, stop it.
And he introduced himself, and so anyway, I'm blown away. I'm a little bit nervous. I deal with anxiety a little bit, so I'm going to work through it. In addition to the Bureau of Justice and Statistics, the Sentencing Project, the folks at the Prison Policy Initiative, the American Constitution Society, many other organizations, my hat goes off to the work that's happening at Vera, and I think that they're like awesome. Okay. Speaking of us, I started an organization about 5 years ago called Justice for All. Bear with me because I'm a little nervous. I don't know why I'm nervous because I know a lot of you, but anyway.
All friends.
And one of the things that offshot from it, if you read the bio, which was ridiculously long and out of control, and I apologize about that, is we realized that we needed a policy apparatus, which resulted in the Racial Justice Reform Coalition, which morphed into the the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing, but I'm still like stuck on Vera, so just bear with me for a minute. For some odd reason, my words on my document just got like 300 times larger than they were a minute ago. The Alliance, under the leadership, I just want to talk a little bit about the Racial Justice Reform, the Racial Justice Alliance, because I'm so proud of the work that they've been doing recently, but under the leadership of a people of color-led group of folks, largely out of the Chittenden County area. How many people have attended one or more of the events that have been sponsored? So we've got a few folks in the room who I'm going to bore the heck out of you. But what we have been able to do is provide a variety of community forums, just lots of panels and lectures, mostly in Chittenden County. How many people remember what equity looks like in Burlington? There was a series that we were nobody. It's like, it was not, oh, I see a couple of hands there. So pulling in, city leadership, we were able to influence policies at the citywide level. I forgot to take notes on that, but we're in the process of hiring a diversity and equity and inclusion director in Burlington, as we've hired one for the state, but we'll come back to that. We've also put together through that work, as a result of that, there will be a standing committee in the City Council on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Chittenden as well. So working to enable folks to learn about systemic racism, because this is really at the heart of the work that we're really doing. I came prepared to tell you my story about my transformation, about how I came to Jesus and all of that stuff, and just how all of this stuff started for me about 5 years ago. Not really Jesus, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to talk about some of the work that we're doing, and if you want to hear more about some of that, then just come to one of the meetings, and I'll be glad to tell you more about how I transferred from a cybersecurity guy to what I'm doing today. It's really not that exciting. But learning about systemic racism, contextualizing lived experiences from folks in the community, providing important perspectives, and also just trying to feed into some of the community policies. Is there a tissue back down there or something like that, just in case my nose starts running? This is pretty weird. First thing I want to tell you about is just a couple of things that we've done. But one that I'm really super proud of is the race traffic stop dashboard. I see that Stephanie Seguino's in the house today. Hey, Stephanie, what's up? And we've used a lot of the research analytics that went into that Stephanie created, and a lot of work that her and Nancy did in many of the projects they've accomplished. And that's all, an aggregation of 79 agencies. One of the things that I came across is last year, in 2018, United Nations Human Rights Council working group of experts on people of African descent concluded that, quote, Mapping the analysis and disaggregated data were crucial to inform policy priorities relating to equality and opportunity for people of African descent. It concluded that, in addition, quote, the refusal of some states to collect and disaggregate data based on race and ethnicity was one of the most serious impediments to the attainment of sustainable development goals and dismantling the structural and systemic barriers to sustainable development that exists for people of African descent in developing and developed countries. Okay, you can read that whole report out on our website. So I thought that to be quite remarkable as I was reading that, and as we began to do the work. I want to give a shout out to Sarah as well. I see you in the room. And the reason why what we're doing is so important is that race traffic stop data, those of you who are from Chittenden County and remember the Uncommon Alliance who started that work back a number of years ago, which fed into Robert Appel was in the room, and Susie Wizawati and Bill Lippert, and all of the work that's been done with Title 20, 2366, with race data collection of all law enforcement agencies across the state is super important. It's important in so many ways that I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about, but it also led into the fair and impartial policing policy. Okay, so that's incredibly important. It's incredibly rich, that information. The problem is that the Crime Research Group, they kind of stopped with the collection of data, which is in about 79 spreadsheets on their website for various years. So there is no comparative nor trend analysis capabilities on any of that data, with the exception of the dashboard that this grassroots organization created. So you can go out to the website and take a look at that, and you can see trending analysis across race traffic stop and also post-stop data as well, thanks to a lot of the work that's been done just from guys that have just decided to just shoulder up and do the work. So that's out there. So I was really excited to tell you that. What else can I tell you? Well, data collection in Vermont is largely, basically, limited to law enforcement, largely. The data, it fails to satisfy the essence of the intent of their data collection. Transparency and progress is really what we're looking at. We're looking at how do we measure progress. So in addition to the law enforcement race data collection, we are leaning into, and part of it has to do with our legislative agenda, which we'll talk briefly about in a second, the race data collection across the state's attorney's offices. I've already began sitting down with Sarah. How many people know Sarah over here? Okay. Sarah George, the state's attorney, the largest county in the state. I've already began working in concert with Sarah to begin the process of collecting data that's been outlined in what we refer to as H-284, which is an emerging bill that seeks to collect data across states' attorneys, judges, as well as corrections. So we're excited about the prospect of being able to, at one point or another, have a roll-up, a dashboard whereby we'll be able to see trends across the entire criminal justice system. We'll talk more about that. I see Ingrid in the house as well, member of the Vermont, we call it the RDAP, I hate to say it, Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel. Okay, we'll come back to that as well. I want to talk briefly also about our Hidden in Plain Sight tour. What we've decided during this session, during this year, at the onset of this year, is because the Vermont Attorney General and Human Rights Commission Task Force, they created this Act 54 Racial Disparities in State Systems report in 2017. Does anyone remember that report? It was a report that came out from the Attorney General and the Human Rights Commission Executive Director, and it was in conjunction with the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel. There was a statewide tour that went on, and what they concluded was, yes, there are racial disparities across housing, education, employment, health services access, economic services as well, okay? So yes, if systemic racism exists anywhere, it exists everywhere. So what we're talking about here is how do we go about getting the message out to our communities that this is a real issue? You see, because a lot of our legislators, they kind of outran their constituency in moving these policies, and we have a lot of rural communities that are out there today who still don't understand this as an issue. In fact, there are probably some people in the room who are really so focused on the criminal justice system that they hadn't really given much thought that only 17% of black people in the state own homes, whereas 71% of white people do, and that the average black family has the median wealth of 1/13 that of the average white family in America. So yes, we've got some issues. So this tour, I just want to let you know that we have been in Barry, we postponed St. Albans, Hartford, Burlington, Bennington, Rutland, St. Johnsbury, Middlebury. We're all over the state, and we're going from now until April. So link up with the site, find out where we'll be. And what the series is about is educating on the systemic racism, and really what it's rooted in is and I believe that Tiffany could probably give a full credited class on it, because I think you did it pretty much. You summed it up in terms of knocking it out of the park on where systemic racism is rooted in the fact that we are a racist nation. I appreciate that. So that's some of the work that we're doing there. I'm going to conclude with just a little bit about the legislative agenda. How many people saw a anti-slavery constitutional amendment? Thanks, Peter Teachout. He also came up as well. That has passed the House and the Senate and the House this year. So it's staged to do the same thing next legislative biennium. Once it does that, you'll see it on the ballot in 2022, in November of 2022, if we're successful next biennium. There are a few other pieces that are happening, moving parts. Just as recent as about 20 minutes ago, I was banging out an email trying to get some attention on some social equity language that we can incorporate in our cannabis taxation and regulation bill that's currently in our House Government Operations as we speak, getting marked up. Somebody didn't have their eye on the ball, and right now we just don't seem to have a very good grip on what social equity language looks like in this very important piece of legislation that really speaks to the damage that's been done across our communities for decades. So we're working on that behind the scene. I got a note that we're going to go to questions, but here's where I'll leave you. I'll just let you know that we have bills on use of force, justice system data collection, as well as reparations. There's a reparations task force bill that's in play right now. It's on the wall in House Government Operations. We can tell you what to do about that. And if you can't remember anything else, remember 828-2228. That's the number you call to let somebody know in the legislature to do something. And the last thing is with the legislative series, we are also in the legislature almost every other week presenting forums related to the aforementioned topics, and some of them will be happening as early as 13th of February, where we'll have that reparations forum. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you all. A little bit of Vermont constitutional information. To amend the Vermont Constitution, it has to pass through 2 successive bienniums. So that's not 2 years, but 2 successive full sessions, and then be put to the voters. So it is a long but overdue process. Thank you for all your comments. We have heard from some incredible prosecutors today, as well as candidates to become DA. And we hear lots of others talk about restorative justice and diversion and pretrial services, but in their mind, that's for so-called low-end or minor offenses. And so my poorly formed question for any of you who'd like to take it is, what is the applicability of restorative justice and a relational approach and a less retributive approach across the spectrum of harms that come into the criminal legal system?
Well, one of the questions you had asked us in terms of preparing today, Bobby, was about initiatives. And while I don't think there's any, well, within Vermont, there is work being done about looking around how restorative justice may be used in cases of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And I think there's trepidation within the victim advocacy community, but that is also our Center for Crime Victim Services and the network of domestic violence and sexual assault programs is at the table and is actually leading these conversations. So within Vermont, that is an area where there's some hard work being done to really look at how restorative justice may play a way to deal with that realm of violent crime. And I would say, and I think we saw these data earlier, that if we really want to reduce incarceration, there's no way to do it without looking at how do we address crimes of violence. And I think there's been, and Sujatha and others have done a lot of work with incidents of violent crime where restorative justice has been a way of where people can admit responsibility, and repairing harm in the context of severe violence can look very different than we might think, and there's no set path for that. But I would say if we really want reform, if we want safe communities, if we want people to feel like they belong in communities, the only way forward is to be using the principles and practices and probably ways we don't even know yet of restorative justice with crimes of violence.
Thanks.
And thank you for that. And also just to add to that, we specifically don't advocate for the use of restorative justice for those low-level offenses because we want to avoid net widening. And so I think earlier, I forget who it was, made a comment about, maybe it was in New York, now if people are caught with drugs and they're sent to services, well, the reality of it is that some people are caught with drugs and they don't have a substance abuse issue, right? And so you're kind of just taking up people's times that they could be, supporting their family or going to work, and also taking up like community resources and state resources by using these kind of like one-size-fit-all models. And so, as you mentioned, Sujatha Balaga, who is the head of our Restorative Justice Project, has used restorative justice for cases as serious as murder. And I think Tiffany had said earlier that overwhelmingly, when you actually ask victims of crimes or survivors of crime what they actually want, a majority of the time it's not incarceration, it's not these really punitive responses. And so I think that we make this kind of false distinction between violent offenses and nonviolent offenses. And the reality of it is that when you actually go into these communities where, there might be high rates of, let's say, gun violence or whatever, they actually have the answers to how to address those issues, but they maybe don't have like the fancy websites or the data all kind of packaged in a really nice little bow. And so I was kind of struggling to understand like how to answer the question, just because I don't really see a line where you say, okay, you can use restorative justice for all these things, but not these things. I think that as long as you have an identifiable victim and someone who's willing to take accountability for the harm that they've caused, you can use restorative justice for anything.
Thank you. So, Sia, you, I think, deliberately used a phrase, the criminal legal system. And so frequently people talk about the criminal justice system, and actually the first time I heard the deliberate phrasing criminal legal system was here when Lee Goodmark, who is a leading advocate for DV reform, spoke. So my question for all of you, simple question, what do you see as the biggest impediments to a criminal legal system that is in fact just? Anyone?
I mean, I don't know how eloquent this is. I think it has to do with simply taking into consideration the needs of people who are also involved in the system, people who are arrested. I think there's far too often we have this sort of othering thing that it's really easy for society to do. And I think obviously understanding that anyone who is involved in the justice system, people are a part of our communities, they're our family members, they're our friends, they are us, we are them. And I think it's just that, to consider all of our needs sort of equally in that. And it goes to, I think, someone referenced that many times people who are involved in the criminal legal system, they are oftentimes victimized or victims themselves. And so I think that is what is important to me. And it sort of ties into the way I approach it from bail as well. It's like thinking about the person's individualized circumstances, like really, really sort of understanding those very specific needs to each person.
Other thoughts?
You know, I think, well, first of all, I'm grateful that I kind of live like I don't really have anything to lose anymore, so I can say a lot of stuff maybe the other panelists won't say. I'm not sure. But this is a racist nation, okay? This is the biggest problem with the justice system is the biggest problem with the nation. It's a racist nation. It was built on racism. It's still racist, okay? The system was designed. It's not broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, you know? And it's all been economic from day one. It's still economic. It's a maritime system, and the judge is the teller. And it's always been like that. And I think as soon as we start having those real conversations about what we're really dealing with, then maybe we might be able to find some real viable solutions.
I think in addition to race, oh, you can clap. I think in addition to racism, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Niels Christie. He's a Norwegian criminologist. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, within the last couple of years. But he wrote about like the state's co-opting of conflict and how, so you have racism, and at the same time you also have like this professionalization of dealing with conflict, right? So we have prosecutors, and you have, when you look at criminal law, it's always U.S. v. Henry or the state v. Henry. You never have, Johnson v. Henry. So it's never actually, we have removed the ability, or maybe I guess the ability was never really there, for people to actually, I feel like I'm just repeating myself at this point, but for people to actually take ownership of their conflict and to figure it out amongst themselves. And so I think that those two things paired together are those biggest impediments.
Let me just come back to that a minute, because it was racism that created class. I mean, it was necessary in this nation to create this thing called race, so we can figure out, so they could figure out where the money went. Okay, so I don't want to purport to be here to tell you a story about race. I told you a staggering statistic about median wealth, for example, a little while ago. It's not an accident. It wasn't. We didn't just wake up one day and all of a sudden, there's this class difference, and wow, most black people are poor, but most poor people are white. Amazing. Well, that's the way it was created, right? So, of course, racism as well as genocide came from greed, which drove profit, pornographic levels of profit, to make us the wealthiest nation in the state, in the world rather. But we still got people sleeping on the sidewalk. What's up with that? So this is a conversation that permeates every single aspect of who we are as a nation, not just the criminal justice system. So when you begin to start looking at, these disparities, I call it the so-called justice system, right? The truth is that there's never been justice from Dred Scott to Plessy versus Ferguson to Fisher versus Texas, right? There's never really been a true justice. It's been aspirational at best, There's never been liberty and justice for all. holding these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's nonsense. It's never been like that, okay? So, it's reflective of how we're seeing it play out on television every evening now, right now, right? And it's not a mistake, it's not an accident that this mess that we're looking at on television, I'm not even gonna say the I word, has manifested itself in our society. Because it all goes back to race.
What I would like to just say also is on a more personal level, that I think we all need to grapple both with two things I want to say. One is I think we need to grapple with concepts of punishment and recognizing when harm is done, and if you think about it, when it's being done to yourself or to a loved one, how we respond. And we live in, yes, a culture of wellness. We also live in a culture of punishment. And it's a huge shift for us to move towards the values of restorative justice. And I think we need to understand that when we're trying to do our persuasion about looking at justice in different ways. And it's in the same way that we need to look at our own, for most of us here, what it means to live in a culture of whiteness. We also need to be looking at what it means to live in a culture of punishment. And it's like we need to do, there's policy reform and legislative advocacy and funding and data and all that, but we also need to really, I guess I'm saying I want to say I really want to work just on my own internal thinking and analysis. I guess in the belief of small change can lead to big change.
So I asked my first-year criminal law students whether we have an innate human desire for punishment, or is it an innate human desire for accountability? And we've conflated those two things. And because we use the language of punishment so much, that's become the default, but it isn't really the human reaction or the human need. But you've inspired all of you. My final question, and then I hope folks in the audience will have some questions, and that is, and I ask this with some trepidation, looking at the big picture, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, one of my favorite quotes is from Antonio Gramsci, who said, pessimism of the intellect plus optimism of the will makes for a good revolutionary. So I want to be both.
Could you say it again? That's great.
Pessimism of the intellect plus optimism of the will makes for a good revolutionary.
Well, I can say with full certainty that I'm incredibly optimistic. I've seen so many things change in the short time. I've been at this for 5 years. I did cybersecurity for 30, and I didn't see anything change. Maybe Cisco created a new VPN or something. But the thing is that seriously though, with the work that we've been doing here in Vermont, and the progress that we've made with the epiphany that has happened in my own personal life, and just all of the context that I've come into and the context that I've been able to make meaning of in the work that we're doing here, and just to see the folks just full of excitement, showing up, incredibly, focused on doing stuff. We got a $6.3 billion business called Vermont that can't even create a portal to show us the information we collect for 79 agencies. And I had a bunch of guys show up and they did it. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I think already, before we started this work, we didn't know Susanna Davis, right? Here she is, right? They got the panel. Ingrid, you've seen the work coming out of the racial disparities panel, and the work that you guys are doing is crazy amazing, and legislators are looking at it. But more importantly, I think hearts and minds are changing across the state. I think that there are folks across the state who are beginning to understand, what it means what does systemic racism mean, and understand I don't have to tell you I'm not a racist anymore because it's not about me. This is the system. I get it, you know. And I think there's a lot of hope for our children as a result of that. I think the schools are beginning to get it figured out. I know a lot of people said it's been far too long, and they're right. But I think today we're better than we were 5 years ago.
So I'll be short. We live in a world where 1 in 3 black men or boys born in 2001, after 2001, will at some point in their lifetimes go to jail and be incarcerated. And so I actually don't have the luxury not to be optimistic about it.
Amen.
I agree with that. I spent the last 4 years doing prison condition work and touring some of our country's most horrific prisons, and I've found it really hard to remain optimistic, but I do this work because I love our community so much. And so I think that the only way to continue to do this work is to have some sense of optimism, even if it's kind of forced.
Love to entertain some questions from you folks.
Yeah, Doug Cavett again. So my biggest thing is, let it be known, I am going to be running for governor, and one of the biggest things is criminal justice reform and restorative justice. So with that being said, and having helped hundreds, if not thousands, of Vermonters who have gone through the legal system and had no justice, and that restorative justice, there's a statute that they weren't ever even told about. Now, I guess, Willa, why don't lawyers discuss this with clients? I think it's 28-2A.
Yeah, so it relates within the realm of the Department of Corrections, and certainly within community justice, restorative justice providers. We talk about that statute a lot. I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't pretend. I don't think it's a policy, as I recall, and others here may. It's a big sort of picture policy, but it isn't. It's a stated. It's in Vermont law that's the policy within Department of Corrections to follow those practices. So it's certainly on the books. How far down it? I haven't read the statute recently to know how broadly it flows out beyond that.
So
Maybe you,
I am a lawyer.
yes.
And it's remarkable that in Vermont, we do have a statute that specifically discusses restorative justice. One could say it's buried within Title 28, which deals with corrections and is not part of the criminal code. So I actually think it would be worthwhile to have an effort to move the restorative justice language out of the statute that deals with corrections into Title 13, which is our criminal code. So that would, if things go well for you, that'd be excellent to move that along.
Study group on the books this year into Bill to look at that whole, where it is and what, we're out of compliance already, so.
So apparently there's a bill or a committee already looking at proper placement for that language and maybe whether we're compliant.
Bobby, is there a place on the other side on this side of the Title 13 that would be just prosecutors, something that drives what? Because criminal code is criminal code. You're already a criminal when you get to Title 13, or you're getting ready to be. I'm just trying to figure out, is there another place for it besides that? I don't know.
Can I jump? I am a lawyer, but not. This is my first time in Vermont. So I will say, just as a recommendation, I think the best way to legislate for restorative justice is to pick whole categories of crime. That way you're taking the discretion away from prosecutors in terms of what cases they're going to divert to restorative justice. So if you say, okay, we start with young people because I think they're a more sympathetic group, but I think that this is something that can be used for all ages. But if you say, I don't know what the juvenile age is here. I think it's 19.
That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just say anyone under, let's say, 20 who commits a robbery will be automatically diverted to restorative justice unless they don't, unless they say that they didn't do it or something like that. That's a really easy, straightforward way of legislating for it.
Just so in Vermont, this applies to adult and youth. If you're charged, so if you're charged with a crime that's eligible for expungement, you shall be offered diversion, and that then it's unless the prosecutor states on the record the reason why that would not serve the interests of justice. And we don't have a good way of collecting, talk about data, those reasons, so it's hard to sort of examine and tease out the different reasons. And as has been alluded to before, we have 14 independently elected state's attorneys who have their own unique worldviews and policies.
Robert.
Hi, this is Robert Appel again. I'm going to ask the same question in a different frame that I asked Tiffany, which is, what's the strategy to get communities, victims, and prosecutors to accept the notion of restorative justice for more serious crime? It's always been a struggle here. The higher up you go on severity of crime and harm to victim, the less likely it is that people will play restorative. I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think you really have to engage the victim community. So I know I keep bringing up Sujatha. She's one of my personal heroes. She talks very openly about being a survivor of child sexual abuse, right? And I think that when you get people who have actually survived really horrific crimes or family members of people who were victims of really horrific crimes, and you hear from them what they want, I think it's really hard to argue with that. Because you can talk all day about the severity of the crime and how much harm you think the victim have, but let people speak for themselves.
Sort of like homicide, survivors who are abolitionists.
Right, exactly.
Other thoughts about more engagement or buy-in?
I think to build on what Sia is saying, it's personal experience, the storytelling, I think, is powerful. And a couple years ago, read Daniel Sered's Until We Reckon, which is her book about common justice, and it's just an amazing, I would highly recommend it. And so that's not our community, but I think sharing those stories and that experience of really powerful transformation is a way to start to build people's willingness to try something. And it takes people like Sarah and others who are willing as prosecutors who take political risks. And we've had a lot of those in Vermont, and I think we continue. So that's partly, to harken back to a previous question, would give me hope around us being able to build that willingness to try.
So I have a question, because we have lots of aspiring lawyers and advocates here. When did each of you realize that you could make a difference?
For me, it was when I started at the Public Defender's Office in Florida. I initially practiced in Florida. I had worked for a year and a half at a firm doing complex litigation and the whole thing, driving all over Florida to do depositions and settlement evaluations and so forth. And it was perfect juxtaposition when I left that and started at the Public Defender's Office in Orlando, Florida, maybe 7 days later, where, I was standing next to someone in court a few days later, and I really had a sense of buy-in that I had never felt before. I want to be clear that, that person's story is their own, and the way I sort of approach being a public defender was simply, so sometimes being their voice, right? I understood the rules of evidence and just enough to have them be their voices be the one that we all heard and that the court heard and that the DA heard. And so for me, it was that moment to sort of like step back and sort of look at myself as a mouthpiece for other people. And of course, as a public defender, you get a lot of, you're entrusted with so much from people who don't know you very well. And I think something about that process did it for me, is just sort of knowing that I had that they trusted me that much, and being able to be a conduit or a tool for them. And so that is when it really started to change for me. And it started on the individual level. It didn't matter, sort of the systemic. I just knew that I was helping people and that I wanted to continue to help people for as much as I possibly could.
Hello. I have a question for the panel. I'm sorry to interrupt. But it's specifically for Anton, but I would be happy to hear from each of the panelists. What do you say to people who have temporary empathy for those like Calif and wake up the next day and forget about that reality? And I guess that speaks to our country seeing so much of this, hearing so much about it. It's kind of becoming normalized, and people are just, say, oh, again, there's nothing, there's no hope. How do you do that on an individual basis and in your profession?
Great. So can we maybe have the other panelists answer the other question first, and then we can sort of jump back there? Sure. Let's do that.
Thanks. So the other question was, when did you realize you could make a difference? And in true RJ fashion, no one has to answer. You can pass.
All right, just me?
Well, so this is, I guess when you say what the image that came to my mind, Bobby, when you asked that question was, I was walking home from school. I don't remember how old I was. I'm guessing 13 or 14. It was a bitterly cold day. And I walked by a house, and there was a baby stroller outside and a baby crying. And there was no one around. And I'm still a shy person, but I was a really shy kid. And I was like, what do I do? And so I just went and knocked on the door. And then this woman came to the door, and I said, your baby's crying. And she was like mortified and pulled the baby carriage in. And I guess, so for me, it was like, oh, I have a voice. I can just knock on a door, and that can make a difference. So that's the story that came to my mind.
I love that story. Okay, I'll go. So I went to a predominantly white, very affluent college, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York, but I was in Durham, North Carolina, and so I felt very out of place in undergrad, and so I ended up spending a majority of my free time off campus, in this, I guess, predominantly low-income community of color, and it's honestly where I felt more comfortable. And I was hanging out with people who, a couple years later, a lot of them ended up being charged and convicted with an assortment of crimes. But again, just having this safe space that I could go and kind of escape from college life. And about a year after I left and I went on to law school, one of the people I was hanging out with in Durham texted me and said, he said two things. He said, one, you inspired me to go back to school, which was really awesome. And I don't think I'd ever even really spoken to him directly about finishing his college degree. And he also said something like, it feels weird saying this out loud to a room full of strangers, but he said, I hope my daughter grows up to be like you. And I thought that was really sweet. And it was this idea that, in my mind, in hindsight, I hadn't really done anything. I was kind of just hanging out as a little college kid. But there's something really powerful about just being yourself around people and just kind of inspiring people just by being you.
I think what I can do is if you don't mind, I'll answer that question briefly, and I'll just pivot over to your question, and then we'll do that. What I'll do is just say that I have no idea when that was. I do know that I was never I'm a child of 1963. Okay, so I'm from Waterloo, Iowa. And I did not hear a peep about the civil rights movement, not one word, okay? There's two things my mother never did. She never talked about that. She never got on a plane, okay? And so with, a long career, military career, retired military, cryptography, cyber, all that other stuff that goes after that, it was an abrupt awakening, when the shots were fired in Ferguson that woke me up. And that was in 14. And so I thought it was more important. The work that I'm doing is more important than being a certified information system security professional or being a certified information system auditor. It's more important, this work here is more important. So what I decided to do is just to turn from that and to begin this work. And I think it was the moment at which that happened when I made that decision, which was, fairly abrupt, that I was certain that I would make a difference in what I was doing, because there's very little that I've ever done in my life where I've devoted my time and attention to where it wasn't effective. It sounds rather braggadocious, but I have no apologies. There was no doubt that there was going to be something that had to give because I was going to focus on it. So I am still at it, and I have no intention on going back to where I came from with cyber. It was good. It was fun. I can still talk about it. Nice, like cocktail party conversations. Good to hear when folks are finally starting to wake up and get it about cyber, because I've been trying to tell you guys for years. But anyway, I don't do that anymore. But there are times, where I see people, or I have seen people over the last 5 years that have had a significant emotional moment, okay? Where they've seen something and they've got all lit up about it and they just on fire and they were running at 100 miles an hour for about 15 minutes. And it was frustrating initially to deal with folk like that who come and go, especially white people, frankly, because they get to go home and be white, So I've had a hard time with that over the period of time that I've been doing this work. And what I've come to understand is I've started to come to understand more and more about meeting people where they are in this work, and it's really important to be for Black people to be compassionate to white people in this work. Now I don't say that for any other reason except for this is kind of what I had to come to terms with, because there's very little other, there are not many other places to go with this thing, At some point or another, you have to come to terms with understanding that, yes, if you really, as a white person, make a decision to change your life abruptly and do so for the rest of your life, there are certain things that you're going to have to part with. There are certain relationships that you're going to have to walk away from. There are certain people that are not going to talk to you anymore, including your family. You're going to have a hard time at work, buddy. And that's just a reality because of the nation that we deal with. And everybody don't have a stomach for that. That's just how it is. But everybody gets to make that decision. Everybody gets to make that decision, and they wake up and they go to sleep and they look at themselves in the mirror every day, and they have to deal with them, right? So I think it's our job to be able to say, just like, the 9th of November in 2016, when everybody woke up losing their mind about Trump, we had to tell them, calm down. We've been doing this for a long time. Go ahead and just walk the walk with me. Understand when you join a battle on the battlefield and there's a war going on and there's an army, there's already a battle plan. Don't try to make one up. You're going to get somebody hurt, okay? Follow us. But if you need to sit down for a minute and take a breath, sit down and take a breath. I'll come back. Maybe you'll be here when I come back. Maybe you'll want to join back in later. I see you've gone as far as you can come now, and really be compassionate about that, right? But every now and then, you see somebody who decides to go the distance, and I think what that does is that little glimmer of hope, I think what it does to me in my life is it makes up for all of it.
So yeah, I would have, yeah. I think you said something that sort of wraps it up for me, which is to meet people where they are. I think that is really what it is Not all of us are at the same point in our journey to sort of understanding people, to tolerance, to sort of dealing with narratives, right? But to meet people where they are, to know that in many instances people have the right intentions but not enough information. I have been on both sides of that myself. So I think that sort of wraps it up for me, is to understand that in order to do the work that we all want to do and to see the change that we all want to change, it's going to take a lot of people who are joined by something. And I don't profess to believe that the people who are not diametrically 100%, know all of the facts about a case and speaking it and preaching it and lifting up names all the time, I don't believe that those people don't care about justice because they don't know all of the details or aren't as personally sort of invested. They still have a lot to offer to the work that we're doing, and so we have to meet each other where we are.
We are getting to the really good stuff, and we are out of time. So I hope you'll all come back, and I hope we can all show our appreciation for our panelists. I'm going to turn over the microphone, I hope, for some final remarks to Carla Usher.
Left one too. Well, happens to the best of us.
What I was gonna say is probably kind of outrageous.
I was gonna do that earlier.
And then you want to shut it down. Just minimize it, please. Okay, can you just cue it up so we can, every second introduce it? Give us one moment. You're just going to rewind it. Go back. Okay, why don't you just sit here? Okay? And it'll project immediately.
I'll need to plug this back in unless you want me to.
Plug it back in now.
Okay.
Yeah. And when does it?
You're ready when you're asking to start.
Okay. If I could have everyone's attention for 1 minute, please. Hello. I think I need Jackie up here. Yes, please. Thank you. Come on. Got it.
Hey, everybody, please pay attention to Carla Usher, president of BALSA. She deserves all of our respect and appreciation. She has put this together, and it would be really great if you could listen to her. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mariana. I want to, thank Professor Sand and all of the panelists for a terrific and informative session. Anton, you talked about the name Calif Browder. That's how I'm, so you missed this because we showed a short video in the morning panel portion of the program, and I think it's really worth re-showing. So it's just a short video, and then we'll make some closing comments. We'll start.
We turn now to another tragic story about a young man who learned the hard way about the troubles plaguing America's criminal justice system. Calif was arrested at 16, never convicted of a crime, never had a trial, but spent more than 3 years in one of the most violent jails in the country. Show Calif had attempted suicide at least 6 times, spent 1,110 days behind bars, more than 800 of those in solitary confinement. His court date postponed more than 30 times. He endured all this having never been given a trial, never convicted of a crime.
A man who served 27 years in prison is now officially exonerated. Governor Cuomo had commuted Felipe Rodriguez's sentence 3 years ago, but he still carried a murder charge on his record. Yesterday, a Queens County judge dismissed that 1990 conviction for the killing of Maureen McNeil Fernandez.
Even simply being accused of a crime is just the beginning of perpetual punishment. A cycle of legalized discrimination, poverty, and reincarceration, a cycle kept in motion by 47,000 laws and regulations nationwide that restrict critical rights and opportunities. After contact with the criminal justice system, millions of Americans are denied employment and health, denied college education, excluded from public benefits, separated from their children, deported despite being legal residents, and deprived of the right to vote. These restrictions trap the poor and people of color in invisible cages that extend far beyond prison walls and criminal courts. Cages that lead to a lifetime of obstacles that undermine even the most earnest efforts at rehabilitation and redemption. Cages that send the message, you will never be a part of society again.
Depending on where you are and where you live, is going to dictate your path through our system. And how you're treated in our system is going to dictate your path in life. Let's be honest about it. And that is why we need a new approach that is governed and guided by restorative justice.
What do you think our system is supposed to do? We know what it does, but what is it supposed to do? And if we want to stop harm and change behavior, then that means investing in people and giving them access to services and support, anything that stabilizes their lives so that they can stay in their communities.
Okay, thank you. We'll get the lights on. Just give me one more second. So again, on behalf of BALSA, the Vermont Law School, we just really want to say a warm thank you to everyone who came out for our Race in the Law series. Race in the Law is probably 5-6 years now. Each year, the BALSA Executive Board decides to turn our attention to focus on a theme. This year, we felt, the board being myself, Ashley Harper, the Vice President, Rico, where's Rico? He's somewhere. Rico Edwards, Treasurer Jackie, Jacqueline Waller, our Secretary. We all came together in September, early September, sat down, and overwhelmingly we knew that we need to use Race in the Law to use this as a platform to focus on this very important issue. We want to thank again all of our panelists. We've been honored to listen to our keynote speakers, the Vermont Attorney General, T.J. Donovan, and of course the career public defender, Tiffany Caban. I mean, people are like, Carly, you're obsessed with Tiffany Caban, and I'm like, don't you know her? But beyond being from New York, I think what I really love about Ms. Caban is that just being from New York and understanding how the political system is just so entrenched and what she accomplished. And as you said, sometimes when you don't win, you become a bigger winner. And I really think you need to understand that you've motivated so many people who saw you just take on the Goliath. And we're humbled and we're so honored and thrilled that you did accept our invitation. And that really goes for all of our panelists. We also had remarks from the Vermont Senate President Tim Ash. And beyond our speakers, we had the opportunity to learn. I think one of the things that when I sat down with Professor Sand and Professor Clark, they wanted to know, Carla, what do you want to come out of this? And I think what I remembered saying was, I want to, if people didn't come in as activists, if they didn't come in, excuse the French, pissed off about what they see, I hope that this conference, this symposium, really did light a fire. So the next time you hear about prosecutors running for office or you hear about a wrongfully convicted person, it really should send a chill up all of our spines. I do realize that Vermont School is known for its environmental law program and emerging the restorative justice program, and I really do feel that this is where Vermont Law School could really blaze a trail for legal education, and we could really set the bar really high because it really needs to be extended. I'd also like to offer my thanks to all the speakers, again, panelists and moderators, Professor Mark Latham, of course, Professor Bobby Sand, for your insight, wisdom, and strategies for criminal justice reform in the 21st century. And with that, finally, I'd also like to thank the members of BALSA, many of whom are 1Ls, and I just can't wait to see what you guys accomplish next year. I won't be here. I'll be on SIP. But we are all so impressed with your leadership qualities. We see it, and we just really can't wait for you guys to take off. So it's really been a pleasure serving as your leader. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Center for Justice Reform, the Student Bar Association, very important, the Office of Student Affairs and Diversity, and specifically Dean Shirley Jefferson. She couldn't be here today, but she's been a wonderful support to our effort here today, and it's shown. The Women's Law Society, in particular, Erica, is Erica here? Yes, Erica's up there. Erica Gerstenberger, LALSA, the Latin American Law Society, and Caribbean Students Law Association, Alliance, I think Alliance is here, and I also want to send a special thank you to our BALSA advisor, that's Professor Joe Brennan, all the way in the back. Thank you so much for being able to come into your office and just bounce ideas off, and you're just extremely receptive. So now, immediately following this event, we're hosting a reception and networking event, if you will, in Yates Commons, which is down the hall. And we hope you'll join us. It's an opportunity to network, nice reception, really nice food. And again, we hope you'll join us. And thank you for participating in our momentous Race in the Law conference. Thank you.